Hey everyone, Guppy Girl here, and welcome to my terrarium plant update. Now, these aquarium plants were the same ones I planted in my first video of transforming aquarium to terrarium plants, and now this is the update. Believe it or not, it's been 184 days of them living in these containers, and they even went through shipping from Seattle to Atlanta. In the second half of the video, I will be going over how I make their new setup and adding a few additional aquarium plants to hopefully transform those ones too. This is Christmas moss, and it's been growing terrestrial for a few months. Now it's been 184 days of it living in this container, and this is what it looks like now. As you can see, it's really tall, and it doesn't even look like Christmas moss anymore at this point. And I'm thinking all these plants were probably in an area that was a little too shaded and didn't get enough light, so that's probably why it looks this way. Hopefully when it's in its new location in a larger container, it will transform into the normal Christmas moss shape. I had a couple containers of Christmas moss. They all look really similar. They're all just really tall and lanky now, and they don't even look like Christmas moss anymore. I'm just going to be transplanting the very top layer of them, so I'll carefully just take them out and put them aside to replant later. One interesting discovery I made was that there was some sphagnum moss growing in some of the containers. Now, I didn't plant any of this, but the substrate I used did have some sphagnum moss that was dried up in it, so there must have been some spores of that in there, and it started growing little sphagnum mosses. I'm not 100% sure on this type of moss, but I believe it is Java moss. I placed orchid bark on top of the Java moss in hopes that would grow up and over, then latch on to the orchid bark, so I'd get little pieces that I could use individually in my terrarium. The moss has grown up and over the bark, but not in the way that I'd expected. It is similar to the Christmas moss, where it's just really tall and lanky now. Out of all the mosses I've been growing, this one is a perfect example of the rhizoids. You can see these little hair-like structures are coming out of the moss. Now you can also see this when it's growing in your aquariums. Rhizoids are a structure that mosses have to help them latch on to other objects. Now, by just looking at this moss and how it's growing straight up, I'm believing that there's just not enough light and the moss is looking for stuff to latch onto so it can grow up towards the light and find a better area for it to grow in. This mixed container of mosses was a bit of a dud because it ended up not growing much other than sphagnum moss. I think the problem was that it wasn't getting enough light, and I also had this one dry out a little more than the other ones, so the moss in here didn't do well. I was trying to cultivate the really thin string-like moss. On the flip side, a good discovery I made was that sabwasertang can be grown in a terrarium-like environment as long as it has more water than most of these other mosses. So this is actually not a moss, it is a fern in the gametophyte stage, according to researchers. Growing sabwasertang in a terrarium environment failed the first time. It got really yellow and translucent, and I mean it's still in the bowl, you can see here, but it's doesn't look healthy. And then I added some new sabwasertang, which is the stuff that I added in January, and that is looking really great and has actually grown quite a bit. The best area to place this in a terrarium, in my opinion, would be to put it along the wall or along an area that gets more moisture. Sabwasertang that is growing along the edge of the container is what's doing best because it's collecting all the moisture and condensation. The Monte Carlo definitely did the best out of all of the plants that were from an aquarium getting converted to terrarium. This plant really did outgrow its container and should have been transplanted sooner. I just didn't have the time. For this plant and the proweed, I grew them in a mixture of terrarium substrate and ADA aquasoil. It was already used aquasoil, and it was all I had available instead of dirt at the time. I used it for these plants and not the mosses because these are root feeders. They'll take up nutrients through their roots rather than the moss will take up everything through its leaves. Now, for the pearlweed, I don't exactly know what it's been trying to do. It's been getting really tall, which is, I guess, a good thing, but it also has been falling over really easily every time I spray it. I think the issue was also wasn't getting enough light. Hopefully, it will be getting enough light in the new location, and I can figure out how it's trying to grow. Lastly is the tub of Christmas moss I made. Now I couldn't ship this, so I ended up taking all the moss out and putting it in a bag. And I just had this sitting close to a windowsill for the longest amount of time. And this is what it looks like now. I've never opened it until this moment, and I was surprised there wasn't any mold or any bugs or anything weird going on. It was just doing its thing. Now, of course, the moss that was below everything that wasn't getting much light, all of that did mostly die off, but that gave a substrate for the moss that was alive to grow on and feed off of. So it was actually doing pretty well, I would say, for not being opened up for several months. The moss really did look well after being enclosed in this bag for 124 days while I was just here in Atlanta, so I'm pretty happy with the results even though some of it died off, and I'm going to be continuing this experiment with a new bag.